7 of the most powerful criminal families in America are seated in one room, and not a single one will speak. They're not waiting for the boss. They're waiting for the wife he just threw away. Tonight, Roman Castelli will discover that the empire he believed he built has been held together by the one person he never bothered to see. And when she walks through those doors, everything he thought he knew will begin to collapse. Stay with this story until the very end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The chandelier above the grand ballroom of the Imperial Crest Hall weighed 4,000 pounds. Hand-cut crystal imported from a factory that no longer existed, suspended from a ceiling painted to resemble a sky no one in this room had ever looked up long enough to notice. It threw fractured light across 96 chairs, 14 round tables draped in ivory linen, and the faces of men and women who had collectively ordered more deaths than most wars. Roman Castelli stood at the entrance and adjusted his cufflink. He didn't need to adjust it. The cufflink was fine, but the gesture gave him a reason to pause at the threshold, to let the room register his arrival, to let the silence stretch just long enough that every head turned toward him before he took his first step inside. That was the thing about Roman. He understood entrances. He had studied them the way other men studied contracts or weapons. The angle of the jaw, the speed of the stride, the exact number of seconds to hold eye contact with the most dangerous person in the room before offering a smile that said nothing and promised less. Tonight, that smile was immaculate. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit cut so close to his body it looked like it had been stitched directly onto his skin. His hair was slicked back, dark and sharp, and the watch on his left wrist cost more than most people's homes. Beside him, her arm threaded through his, stood Nadia Belrose, tall, platinum blonde, wearing a red dress that left very little to interpretation and even less to the imagination. Nadia was not his wife. Everyone in this room knew that. Roman didn't care. In fact, he preferred it that way. Bringing Nadia was a message, and the message was simple. I do what I want. I answer to no one. And if any of you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with the 6 armed men walking 3 paces behind me. He crossed the ballroom floor with the kind of confidence that comes not from courage, but from having never been told no by anyone who mattered. His shoes clicked against the marble. Nadia's heels clicked beside him. The sound was rhythmic, almost theatrical, and Roman liked that too. He liked the performance of power. He always had. The ballroom was arranged for what the underworld simply called the Summit, a once every 3 years gathering of the 7 most powerful criminal organizations operating on American soil. The Castellis out of New York, the Yoon family from Chicago, the Delacroix Syndicate in New Orleans, the Moretti operation based in Philadelphia, the Okamura Group from Los Angeles, the Hargrove Network spanning most of the Southeast, and the Jung family, whose territory stretched from San Francisco to Seattle and whose patriarch, Liang Jung, was the oldest living crime lord in the Western Hemisphere. These were not people who gathered casually. The summit existed because decades ago, someone realized that when powerful families stopped talking, they started killing. The agreements signed at each summit regulated territory, trade routes, conflict resolution, and the invisible rules that kept the American underworld from devouring itself. Roman had attended his first summit at 23, standing behind his father's chair. His father, Enzo Castelli, had been the kind of man who spoke softly and carried enough influence to rearrange the geography of organized crime with a single phone call. When Enzo died, a heart attack at 61, his body finally surrendering to decades of pressure his mind had refused to acknowledge, Roman inherited everything. The name, the network, the seat at the table. He was 34 now, and this was his 4th summit as head of the Castelli family. He expected it to go like the others. He was wrong. Roman reached the center of the room and stopped. He released Nadia's arm, buttoned his jacket with one hand, and looked around the ballroom with the expression of a man surveying his kingdom. No one was sitting down. He blinked. The tables were set. The place cards were arranged. The water glasses were filled. Everything was in position for the formal opening. The traditional toast, the reading of the previous agreements, the ceremonial acknowledgement of each family's representative. But every chair was empty. The delegates stood in clusters around the edges of the room, speaking in low voices, their security details positioned behind them like chess pieces waiting for a game that hadn't started. Roman spotted Marin Delacroix near the east windows, her silver hair pulled into a tight braid, her expression as warm as a closed fist. Beside her, Victor Yoon leaned against a pillar with his arms crossed, watching Roman the way a predator watches something it hasn't decided to eat yet. Across the room, Lianjing sat in a wheelchair near the bar, flanked by his two grandsons, his ancient eyes tracking Roman's every movement with the patience of a man who had seen better leaders come and go. None of them moved toward the table. Roman's smile didn't falter, but something behind it shifted. A flicker, a crack in the glass. He turned to his right-hand man, Dominic Sava, who had materialized beside him with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years anticipating problems before they became crises. Dominic was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, built like a retired boxer who hadn't fully retired. His face was the kind that never gave anything away for free. "Why is nobody sitting?" Roman kept his voice low, barely moving his lips. Dominic leaned closer. "They won't start." "What do you mean, they won't start?" "I mean they're refusing to begin the summit." Roman's jaw tightened. He could feel the muscles in his neck constricting, a physical response he hated because it was the one thing he couldn't fully control. "On what grounds?" Dominic hesitated. That hesitation, barely half a second, was the loudest alarm Roman had ever heard from the man. Dominic Sava did not hesitate. Dominic Sava had once negotiated the release of 3 hostages while bleeding from a knife wound in his left shoulder without raising his voice. Hesitation was not in his vocabulary. "They want Valentina," Dominic said. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Roman stared at him. "What?" "Every delegation, all 7, they've each made the same statement independently. They will not begin until Valentina Ashcroft is present in the room." Roman felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear, he would never have named it that, but something adjacent. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as fear, but wore different clothes. "She's not coming," he said. "She wasn't invited." "I know." "Then tell them to sit down." Dominic looked at him for a long moment. The look said everything his mouth wouldn't. It said, "I already tried." It said, "They won't listen." It said, "You don't understand what's happening here, and I'm not sure I do either." "Roman," Dominic said carefully, "Liang Zheng's people delivered a written statement 20 minutes ago. It says, and I'm quoting directly, "The Zhang family does not recognize the authority of this summit in the absence of Valentina Ashcroft. No agreement signed without her presence will be honored." Roman's hand curled into a fist at his side. That's one family. It's all of them. Delacroix, Yoon, Moretti, Okamura, Hargrove, every single one. They want her here. She's my wife, Dominic. She doesn't run anything. She doesn't sign anything. She stands next to me at events and smiles. That's her function. The words came out harder than he intended, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice he rarely listened to whispered that he didn't fully believe them. He crushed that voice the way he crushed everything inconvenient, with speed and without looking back. Dominic said nothing. Roman turned and walked toward the nearest cluster of delegates. His stride was long, purposeful, and carried the kind of manufactured authority that works on people who are already afraid of you. The problem was that no one in this room was afraid of Roman Castelli. They respected the Castelli name the way you respect a loaded weapon. Not because of what it is, but because of what it can do. He approached Marin Delacroix first, because she was the one he understood least, and therefore the one he trusted least, and therefore the one whose refusal felt the most dangerous. Marin ran the Delacroix syndicate with the precision of a surgeon and the temperament of a rattlesnake. She was 62 years old and had buried 3 husbands, 2 of whom had died of causes that remained technically undetermined. "Marin," Roman stopped 2 feet in front of her and clasped his hands behind his back. "I'm told there's some confusion about the proceedings tonight." Marin looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has shown up to an exam without a pencil. "There's no confusion, Roman." "Then sit down." No. The word was flat, unapologetic, and absolute. It wasn't spoken with anger or contempt. It was spoken with the certainty of someone who had made a decision long before walking into this room. Roman held her gaze. "May I ask why?" "You may. And I'll give you the same answer I gave your man Dominic. Valentina Ashcroft has been the stabilizing force behind every significant agreement this summit has produced for the last 11 years. She has personally mediated 6 territorial disputes that would have escalated into open conflict. She has identified and neutralized 3 separate attempts to undermine the alliance from within. And she has done all of this without credit, without title, and apparently without your knowledge. Marin paused. I will not sign a single document in a room where the person who actually understands what those documents mean is not present. Mam motsas putyanis. Roman's expression didn't change, but inside his chest, something shifted, a tectonic plate moving beneath the surface of everything he thought he knew. Valentina is a hostess, he said. She plans seating arrangements and picks flower centerpieces. Marin stared at him for 3 full seconds, and then she did something Roman had never seen her do in 15 years of attending these gatherings. She laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the laugh of someone watching a man confidently walk toward a cliff edge while insisting the ground continues. "Oh, Roman," she said softly, "you really don't know, do you?" She turned and walked back toward the east windows without another word. Roman stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the most dangerous people in America, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt the floor beneath him tilt. He moved through the room like a man wading through water that was slowly rising. He spoke to Victor Yoon, who told him bluntly that Valentina had personally prevented a war between the Yoon family and the Moretti operation 4 years ago, a conflict Roman didn't even know had nearly started. He spoke to Kenji Okamura, who explained with barely concealed irritation that Valentina had restructured 3 of the alliance's most critical trade agreements during the last summit, while Roman was in the hospitality suite drinking bourbon with people who didn't matter. He spoke to Liang Zheng, who simply looked at him from his wheelchair with those ancient, unblinking eyes and said, in a voice like dry leaves scraping across stone, "Bring her here." Every conversation was a different knife. Every revelation cut deeper. And with each one, the picture assembled itself with terrible clarity. Not of Valentina as a quiet wife in the background, but of a woman who had been running the invisible architecture of this alliance for over a decade, while Roman paraded across the visible surface like a flag on someone else's flagpole. He retreated to a private corridor behind the ballroom, his security detail flanking him, and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. He hadn't called Valentina in 3 weeks. The last time they'd spoken, he had told her, through his lawyer, because he couldn't be bothered to say it himself, that she would not be attending the summit, that her presence was no longer required, that Nadia would be accompanying him instead. He had expected her to argue. She hadn't. She had simply said, "I understand," and hung up. At the time, he had taken that response as submission. Now, standing in this corridor with sweat gathering at the base of his spine, he wasn't sure what it was. He dialed. The phone rang 4 times. 5, 6. She picked up on the 7th. "Roman." Her voice was calm, not cold, calm. The voice of someone sitting in a chair they've chosen, in a room they've arranged, at a time they've decided. "Valentina, I need you at the summit." A pause. 3 seconds. He could hear her breathing, slow, measured, controlled. The breathing of someone who had anticipated this call. Why? The question was a blade, and Roman walked straight into it. Because the delegations won't start without you. All of them? She already knew the answer. He could hear it in the way she asked. Not with surprise, but with confirmation. She was checking a box on a list she'd already completed in her head. "All of them," he said. Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before he could respond. Roman stood in the corridor staring at his phone, and for a disorienting moment, he felt like a man who had been living in a house for 11 years and just discovered it had an entire wing he'd never entered. He walked back into the ballroom. Nadia was waiting near the bar, looking bored and beautiful, scrolling through her phone with the languid indifference of someone who had been brought to a party where she knew no one and cared even less. She looked up when Roman approached and smiled, a professional smile, the kind that costs money to maintain. "Baby, this place is dead. When do we eat?" "Not now, Nadia." Something in his tone made her smile flicker. She studied his face, searching for the version of Roman she was accustomed to, the confident one, the one who always had the room by the throat. She didn't find it. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing, just wait here." He left her at the bar and moved toward the west corridor, where Dominic was standing with a tablet in his hand and an expression that suggested the news was getting worse. "There's something else," Dominic said before Roman could speak. "Of course there is. I've been reviewing the preliminary documents for tonight's agreements, the ones our legal team prepared last month." "What about them?" Dominic turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was a side-by-side comparison of two documents. They looked identical at first glance. Same formatting, same headers, same signatures. But Dominic had highlighted several passages in red, and as Roman's eyes moved across the differences, a new kind of cold settled into his chest. "These aren't the same documents," Roman said. "No. The versions distributed to the delegations this evening contain 17 alterations. Territory boundaries have been redrawn, revenue sharing percentages have been changed, conflict resolution protocols have been modified in ways that would give certain parties significantly more authority than what was originally agreed upon." "Who altered them?" "I don't know yet, but whoever did it had access to our secure servers, our encryption keys, and our internal review process. This wasn't an outside job, Roman. This came from inside." Roman looked at the tablet, and the cold in his chest became something else, something sharper, something with teeth. "Who saw these documents before distribution?" "Your legal team, your operations director, your assistant, and Valentina." Roman's head snapped up. "Valentina saw these?" "She's had access to all Summit documents for the last 11 years. You gave her that access yourself back when you first took over. You told me, and I remember the exact words, 'Let her handle the paperwork. I don't have time for that.'" The memory hit Roman like a slap. He did remember saying that. He remembered it because it was the same day he'd decided that Valentina's role in his organization was administrative at best, decorative at worst. He'd handed her the keys to the filing cabinet and walked away, never once looking back to see what she built inside it. 41 minutes later, 1 minute past her estimate, which Roman noted with a tightness in his jaw that he couldn't explain, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Valentina Ashcroft walked in. She was not dressed for a gala. There was no evening gown, no jewelry catching the chandelier light, no careful arrangement of hair designed to complement a man's arm. She wore a black tailored blazer over a white shirt, dark trousers, and flat shoes that made no sound on the marble floor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot. She carried a leather briefcase in her left hand and nothing else. She looked like she had come to work. The room changed the moment she appeared. It was not a dramatic shift. No gasps, no sudden movements, no theatrical reactions. It was subtler than that and somehow more powerful. The clusters of delegates seemed to relax, as if a held breath had been released simultaneously across the entire room. Marin Delacroix uncrossed her arms. Victor Yoon pushed off the pillar and stood straight. Liang Zheng nodded once, a gesture so small it could have been missed, but Roman saw it, and he understood its weight. They were acknowledging her, not as his wife, not as an accessory to his name, as her. Valentina walked to the center of the ballroom and set her briefcase on the nearest table. She didn't look at Roman. She didn't look at Nadia, who was staring at her from the bar with the expression of someone who had just realized she was standing in the wrong story. She looked at the room, all of it, every face, every corner, every shadow, with the quiet, measuring gaze of a woman taking inventory. Then she opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick folder, and spread its contents across the table. "The documents you received tonight have been compromised," she said. Her voice carried without effort. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a sound that people lean toward, not away from. A voice that commanded attention not through volume, but through the unmistakable weight of certainty. 17 alterations across 4 primary agreements, she continued, laying pages side by side with the efficiency of someone who had already spent hours analyzing them. Territory boundaries between the Yun and Moretti families have been redrawn to create overlapping claims in 3 districts. Revenue sharing percentages for the Pacific Corridor have been adjusted by 4 points in favor of a party that doesn't officially exist in our records. And the conflict resolution protocols have been rewritten to remove the mediation clause that has prevented 3 wars in the last 8 years. She looked up from the papers. If these documents had been signed tonight, the alliance would have collapsed within 6 months, possibly less. The silence that followed was absolute. Roman watched from the edge of the room, his arms at his sides, his mouth slightly open, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. This was his wife. This was the woman he had sent away 3 weeks ago with a message delivered through a lawyer. This was the woman whose opinion he had never once asked about anything that mattered, and she had just walked into a room full of killers and kings and taken command as if she'd been doing it her entire life. Because she had. Victor Yoon was the first to speak. He stepped forward, his security detail shifting behind him like a school of fish adjusting to a current. "How long have you known?" "I identified the first discrepancy 4 days ago," Valentina said. "I've spent the time since verifying each alteration and tracing their origin within the Castelli organization's internal systems." "You traced them," Victor repeated. "Not a question. The alterations were introduced through our secure document management system using credentials that belong to someone with senior-level access. The modifications were made incrementally over a period of 3 weeks, each one small enough to pass a routine review, but significant enough to fundamentally change the terms of the agreements." Roman felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, something more structural, something load-bearing. She had known for 4 days. She had known, and she had worked alone. And she had come tonight not because he asked, but because the Alliance needed her. His phone call hadn't summoned her. It had merely confirmed her timing. The realization made him dizzy. Valentina spent the next 90 minutes doing something Roman had never witnessed in 11 years of marriage. She worked. Not the kind of work he understood. The phone calls, the threats, the shows of force that constituted his definition of leadership. She worked with paper and patience and precision, moving between delegations, explaining the alterations to each one individually, answering questions with a depth of knowledge that revealed years of invisible labor. She knew the history of every disputed territory. She knew the revenue figures for every shared operation. She knew the names of the mediators who had settled every conflict, because in most cases, she had been the one to select them. She knew which families had grudges that predated the alliance, and which alliances were newer than they appeared, and which handshake deals had been made in private that contradicted the public agreements. She knew everything, and Roman, standing against the wall, watching, silent, knew nothing. It was like watching someone reveal the blueprint of a building he had lived in for over a decade. Every room he thought he understood had hidden passages. Every wall he thought was solid had doors he'd never opened. The structure he believed he had inherited from his father was, in truth, a structure Valentina had been quietly redesigning, reinforcing, and maintaining while he walked its halls thinking the walls held themselves up. At some point during the evening, he couldn't have said exactly when, Nadia left. He didn't notice her departure. He was standing near a pillar, watching Valentina explain a complex territorial arrangement to Kenji Okamura, using a hand-drawn map she'd produced from her briefcase. And when he turned to look for Nadia, her chair at the bar was empty, her champagne glass sitting alone on the counter like a monument to irrelevance. He didn't care. That was the thing that frightened him. Not that she'd left, but that he didn't care. Nadia was beautiful and willing and uncomplicated. And 12 hours ago, those qualities had felt like everything he needed. Now watching Valentina work, watching her navigate a room full of people who could end lives with a phone call, speaking to each of them with a directness that bordered on audacity, he understood that what he'd wanted from Nadia wasn't companionship. It was comfort. The comfort of being around someone who never challenged him, never outperformed him, never made him feel like the smallest person in a room he was supposed to own. Valentina made him feel exactly that. And he hated it, and he needed it, and he had no idea what to do with either feeling. Around midnight, Valentina finished her review. She gathered her papers, organized them into the folder, and placed the folder back in her briefcase. Then she walked to the center of the room, the same spot where Roman had stood 4 hours earlier, smiling his perfect smile while the empire crumbled beneath his feet, and addressed the full assembly. "The corrected documents will be prepared by my team and distributed to each delegation within 48 hours, she said. "I recommend that we postpone the formal signing until every party has had the opportunity to review the authenticated versions. In the meantime, I'll continue the investigation into who compromised the originals." Marin Delacroix spoke from across the room. "And if you find them?" Valentina looked at her. The expression on her face was not anger. It was not vengeance. It was something colder and more permanent. the expression of a woman who had spent 11 years holding an empire together with invisible hands and had run out of patience for anyone who tried to tear it apart. "Then I'll bring them to this room," she said, "and let the Alliance decide what happens next." Myron nodded. Victor Yoon nodded. One by one, around the room, the heads of 7 criminal dynasties acknowledged her statement with the kind of silent assent that carries more authority than any signature on any document. The room began to empty slowly, each delegation departing with their security details, their whispered conversations, their reassessed assumptions. Roman watched them leave and noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Every single one of them stopped to speak to Valentina on the way out. Not to him, to her. Liangjung's wheelchair was pushed past him by one of his grandsons. The old man reached out as he passed Valentina and took her hand. He held it for 3 seconds, an eternity from a man who communicated primarily in nods and silences, and said something Roman couldn't hear. Valentina bowed her head slightly. When Jung released her hand, he was pushed toward the door without a glance in Roman's direction. The last delegation exited at 12:47 in the morning. The ballroom was empty except for Roman, Valentina, Dominic, and the cleaning staff who hovered at the periphery, waiting for permission to begin. Valentina closed her briefcase. Roman walked toward her. His footsteps echoed in the empty room. A different sound now, hollow and too loud, stripped of the confidence that had accompanied his entrance hours earlier. "Val." She turned to face him. Her expression was neutral, composed, and completely unreadable. He searched it for something: anger, satisfaction, resentment, triumph, and found nothing he could identify. She looked at him the way you look at a problem you've already solved but haven't yet filed away. "We need to talk," he said. "We do, but not tonight." Valentina. Roman. She said his name the way she said everything, with precision and without excess. "I've been awake for 39 hours. I've identified a security breach in your organization that nearly collapsed a multi-billion-dollar alliance. And I did it because I received a call from Marin Delacroix 4 days ago telling me that something was wrong with the summit documents." She paused. "Not a call from you, from Marin." The words hit him in a place he didn't have armor. "You didn't even know," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was a fact, delivered with the same calm efficiency she'd used all evening, stripped of emotion because the emotion had been burned out of it years ago. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I'll be in the residence," she said. "I need 4 hours of sleep. After that, I'll begin the internal investigation. Whoever altered those documents is still inside your organization, Roman. They have access to everything. And whatever they were trying to accomplish tonight, starting a war between 7 families, that wasn't an accident and it wasn't improvised. It was planned, carefully, by someone who knows exactly how this alliance works." She picked up her briefcase. "Someone who learned it by watching me." She walked toward the exit without looking back. Roman stood alone in the empty ballroom beneath the 4,000-pound chandelier, surrounded by 96 empty chairs and the scattered remains of a night that had rearranged the architecture of his entire world. Dominic appeared beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Roman said, "How long?" Dominic understood the question. "How long has she been doing this?" "Yes." Dominic exhaled slowly. "Since the beginning, Roman, since you took over, since you handed her the files and told her to handle the paperwork." "And you knew?" Another hesitation. Shorter this time, but just as loud. "I suspected. She never asked for recognition. She never asked for credit. She just did the work. And the work was so seamless, so invisible, that it was easy to believe the machine was running itself." Roman closed his eyes. The machine was never running itself. She was running it. All of it. Every negotiation, every compromise, every crisis averted, every war prevented, every agreement that held, every bridge that didn't burn. It was her. And he had spent 11 years standing on top of the building she'd constructed, waving at the crowd below, convinced the view was something he'd earned. He opened his eyes and looked at the table where Valentina had spread her documents. A single page had been left behind. Whether deliberately or accidentally, he couldn't tell. He picked it up. It was a list, handwritten. Valentina's handwriting, which he recognized because it was one of the few things about her he'd actually bothered to notice. Small, precise, every letter formed with the same careful discipline she applied to everything. The list contained 6 names. 6 people within the Castelli organization who had the technical access and security clearance to modify summit documents. The first 5 names were crossed out. The 6th name was circled. Roman stared at it, and the blood drained from his face so fast he felt his knees buckle. He knew that name. He trusted that name. He had given that name access to every private conversation, every strategic decision, every vulnerable piece of information in his entire operation. That name had sat in every meeting, poured his coffee, managed his calendar, screened his calls, drafted his correspondence. That name had been the first person he spoke to every morning and the last person he spoke to every night. That name was Marcus Viel, his executive assistant, his most trusted employee, the man who knew every secret Roman Castelli had ever kept. Dominic was reading over his shoulder. Roman heard the sharp intake of breath, the first truly uncontrolled reaction he had ever witnessed from a man who had built an entire career on the absence of such reactions. "She left this on purpose," Dominic said quietly. Roman didn't respond. He was staring at the circled name, and behind his eyes, 11 years of memories were rearranging themselves. Every conversation Marcus had overheard, every document Marcus had handled, every meeting Marcus had attended, every door Marcus had opened and closed. Every door. Every single door. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. He looked at it. 4 words. "He's still in the building." Roman's head snapped up. He looked at Dominic. Dominic was already reaching for his weapon. Somewhere in the Imperial Crest Hall, behind the walls of a building that had just hosted the most powerful criminals in America, a man who had spent a decade selling their secrets was still breathing the same air. And the night was far from over. The text had come from a burner. Roman knew that before Dominic even ran the trace, because anyone inside his organization with enough access to compromise summit documents would know better than to use a registered line. The number was already dead by the time Dominic's man put the call through to their tech operator. 4 words sent from a phone that no longer existed, pointing at a man who was still somewhere inside a building the size of a city block. Roman pocketed the list and moved. He didn't run. Running was panic, and panic was information. It told everyone watching that you didn't have control of the situation. Roman walked fast, the way his father had taught him, with his jaw set and his eyes forward and his hands loose at his sides, like a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply moving toward the moment of doing it. Dominic flanked him. 2 security men fell in behind them without being told. The Imperial Crest Hall had 6 floors above ground and 2 below. The ballroom occupied the entire west wing of the ground floor. Behind it, connected by a series of service corridors that the cleaning staff used and the delegates never saw, were the building's operational arteries: kitchens, storage rooms, server rooms, mechanical infrastructure, and at the far end of the eastern basement, a suite of private offices that the hall's management rented to organizations requiring discretion. The Castelli family had rented one of those offices for the past 11 years. Roman had been in it twice. He knew, without knowing exactly how he knew, that Marcus Viel was in it now. They took the service stairs. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and old concrete, and the fluorescent lighting overhead flickered at irregular intervals in a way that would have felt cinematic if Roman's heart wasn't hammering so hard he could feel it in his back teeth. He breathed through his nose, slow, even, controlled, and focused on the sound of his own footsteps. Dominic spoke quietly as they descended. "If it's him, we need to know who he's been talking to. We can't just—" "I know." "Roman, we need him alive." "I know, Dominic. You don't sound like you know." Roman stopped on the landing between floors and turned to look at him. In the flickering light, Dominic's face was all shadows and sharp angles. He looked older than Roman had ever noticed before. Or maybe Roman was just noticing things now that he'd been too comfortable to see. "Marcus has been in my house," Roman said. His voice was low and absolutely flat. "He's eaten at my table. He's held my son's birthday presents. He was at my father's funeral." He paused. "I know we need him alive. I also know that when I see his face, I'm going to need about 30 seconds before I can function like a rational human being, so just give me the 30 seconds. Dominic said nothing. Then he nodded once. They continued down. The basement corridor was empty. The offices at the far end had their lights off, but there was a thin line of yellow under the last door. The Castelli office. The one Roman had been in twice. The one Marcus had been in hundreds of times because Marcus handled everything Roman couldn't be bothered to handle himself. Roman put his hand flat against the door. Behind him, he heard one of the security men click the safety off a weapon. The sound was very small and very loud at the same time. He pushed the door open. Marcus Viel was sitting at the desk with a phone to his ear. He was 41 years old, medium height, with the kind of unremarkable face that was specifically useful in a profession that required people to overlook you. He had worked for Roman for 9 years. Before that, he had worked for Enzo Castelli for 2. He had a daughter in middle school in Brooklyn and a sister in Oregon, and a standing reservation at a Thai restaurant on 44th Street every Friday night because he liked routines and he liked consistency, and he liked, above all else, knowing exactly how every situation was going to end. When the door opened, his expression did something complicated. It collapsed and rebuilt itself in less than a second, the instinctive attempt to reassemble a face that had already given everything away. The phone dropped from his ear. His free hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, and the security man behind Roman said, quietly and with great clarity, "Don't." Marcus's hand stopped. The phone lay on the desk, the call still connected, and from it came the faint sound of breathing on the other end of the line. Then, without another sound, that breathing stopped. The call ended. Whoever had been on the other end was gone. Roman walked into the room and sat down in the chair across the desk from Marcus. He did it the way he'd done everything that night, slowly, deliberately, as if the world was operating at whatever speed he set. He clasped his hands on the desk in front of him and looked at Marcus Viel for the 30 seconds he'd asked Dominic for. Marcus stared back. His face was pale. Sweat had gathered at his temples. His right hand was still hovering at waist level, frozen between an action he hadn't taken and a position that wasn't quite surrender. Roman watched the sweat. He watched Marcus's throat work as he swallowed. He watched the slight tremor in the hovering hand and the way Marcus's eyes kept moving. Not to Dominic, not to the security men, but to the door, calculating the distance, the angle, the probability. That calculation was taking place behind a face Roman had seen every day for 9 years. A face he had trusted with everything, a face that had been lying to him since the beginning. 30 seconds. "Put your hand on this desk," Roman said. Marcus put his hand on the desk. Both of them. Both hands appeared on the surface, fingers spread, palms down. "Good." Roman leaned back in his chair. "Now we're going to talk." "Roman." Marcus's voice was lower than usual, stripped of the professional polish that had always made him sound like he was simultaneously taking notes and managing expectations. "Whatever you think, don't." Roman's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It simply became more precise, like a blade being drawn from a very quiet scabbard. "Don't tell me what I think. Don't tell me I've made a mistake. Don't try to explain. Just answer questions." A beat. "How long?" Marcus looked at him. "How long have you been feeding information outside this organization?" The silence stretched. Marcus's jaw moved. Roman watched him weigh his options: denial, partial admission, negotiation, deflection. Watched him cycle through them like a man searching drawers for a key he already knew wasn't there. 4 years, Marcus said. Dominic made a sound behind Roman. A small sound, barely audible. The sound of a man absorbing a number that changes the shape of everything. 4 years, Roman repeated. Yes. My father died 3 years ago. Yes. Roman's hand, still clasped on the desk, tightened until the knuckles went white. He was aware of this. He didn't unclasp them because the alternative was worse. Who? He said. I can't. Marcus. Roman leaned forward. Look at the 2 men standing behind me. Look at them carefully. Think about what their job is, and think about whether there is a single reason, one reason, why I would not give them a very simple instruction right now. Marcus looked. He looked carefully, the way Roman had asked. Conrad Hale, Marcus said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Dominic went very still. Roman watched him go still, which told him that Dominic knew the name, and the fact that Dominic knew it and had never mentioned it was its own small explosion in the already burning building of this night. Conrad Hale, Roman said. Say it again. Conrad Hale. He operates out of the Pacific Corridor, officially listed as a logistics consultant for 3 independent shipping companies. Unofficially, I know what he is unofficially. Roman didn't know. But he would be damned if he was going to let Marcus see that. Conrad Hale was not a name that appeared in the Castelli organization's files. Roman ran a quick inventory of his memory, every briefing, every report, every name Dominic had ever brought to his attention, and came up empty. Conrad Hale was a name that should have appeared in his world and hadn't, which meant either the man was extraordinarily careful or someone had been making sure he stayed invisible. He looked at Marcus and understood that it was the second option. "What did you give him?" Roman asked. "Schedules, routes, summit documents?" Marcus swallowed. "Alliance membership information, private communication protocols, security codes." He paused. "Everything. Everything. Everything I had access to." Which was everything, because Roman had given Marcus access to everything, because Roman had been too important and too busy and too arrogant to manage his own information infrastructure, so he had handed it to a man with a forgettable face and a reliable manner, and never once looked too closely at either. Roman stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, but something in it made Marcus press back into his chair. "Why?" Roman said. "Why does anyone do anything?" The answer came out rougher than Marcus probably intended. A crack in the professional veneer, something raw underneath. "Money. I was paid very well. And I was good at it, Roman. 9 years. I was right in front of you for 9 years, and you never. Don't." Roman's voice had gone somewhere different now, colder than before, and quieter, which was worse. "Don't make me the reason. I'm not making you anything. I'm telling you the truth since you asked for it. You compromised the summit documents. You nearly started a war between 7 families. That was Hale's operation. I gave him the access. What he did with it, you gave him the access," Roman said. "You handed him the keys to a house full of people and let him plant whatever he wanted inside it. That makes the house yours." Marcus's mouth closed. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the basement above them, or below them, Roman had lost track of the building's geography. A pipe groaned and settled. The fluorescent light in the corner of the office buzzed with a frequency that had been irritating Roman since he entered, and that he was now somehow grateful for because it gave him something other than Marcus's face to focus on. "Dominic," Roman said without turning around, "find out everything you can about Conrad Hale. Tonight." "I'll need tonight, Dominic." A pause. "Yes." Roman looked at Marcus one more time. The man who had sat 3 feet outside his office door for 9 years. The man who had screened his phone calls and coordinated his schedule and brought him coffee at exactly the temperature he preferred because Marcus knew everything, noticed everything, remembered everything. The perfect assistant, the perfect spy. "You're going to tell us everything Hale knows," Roman said. "Every piece of information you passed to him, every plan he mentioned, every name he used, every location, all of it. And you're going to tell it truthfully and completely, because the alternative is that I stop being interested in what you know and start being interested in something much simpler." Marcus nodded, the nod of a man who has stopped running. Roman walked out of the office. He made it to the corridor before the feeling hit him. Not nausea exactly, but its architectural cousin, the physical response to a structure collapsing. He put one hand against the concrete wall and breathed. The wall was cold. He focused on that. Cold, rough, real. Not a performance, not a posture, not a version of himself assembled for an audience. Just cold concrete and the sound of his own breathing. Footsteps. He straightened before she reached him. Valentina came around the corner from the direction of the stairwell, still in her blazer, still carrying the briefcase. She stopped when she saw him, saw his hand on the wall, saw the color in his face, saw whatever else his face was doing that he hadn't yet gotten under control, and she assessed all of it in approximately 2 seconds the way she assessed everything. "You found him," she said. "He's talking. Is Dominic in there?" "Yes." She started to move past him toward the office door. Roman's hand came off the wall and caught her arm. Not hard. Not a grab. Just contact. His fingers on her sleeve, stopping her motion without forcing it. She looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at his face. 4 years, he said. "I know." "You knew it was 4 years?" "I suspected the timeline. The document trail suggested someone had been operating inside the organization for at least that long. The alterations had a pattern, incremental, systematic, each one building on the last. That takes time to set up. Roman stared at her. When did you figure it out? She looked at him steadily. 6 months ago. I started seeing anomalies in the communication logs, small things, a response time here, a routing discrepancy there. I didn't have the full picture until 4 days ago. 6 months, he said it slowly. You've been investigating a security breach in my organization for 6 months without telling me. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, not defensiveness. Something more complicated. The look of someone who has held something difficult for a very long time and is now deciding how much truth the other person is ready to hear. I tried to tell you, she said, 3 times. In February, in April, and once in June. The first 2 times you were in meetings. The 3rd time you told me you were busy and asked me to put it in an email. The words went into him like something very thin and very sharp. He didn't remember the meetings. He didn't remember telling her to send an email. He believed her completely, and that was the worst part. The absolute certainty that she was telling the truth, that he had been in the same room as a warning and walked past it 3 times because he was too busy, too confident, too thoroughly convinced that anything Valentina had to say could wait until he had a moment that was never going to come. He released her arm. She walked past him and into the office. Roman stood in the corridor alone. He could hear her voice through the open door. Precise, controlled, moving directly into the interrogation without preamble or ceremony. He heard Marcus answer. He heard Dominic interject once, and heard Valentina redirect the conversation back to the core question with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. He wondered how many times she'd done this before. He wondered how many rooms like this she had walked into while he was somewhere else being important. He walked back upstairs. The ballroom was being cleaned now, the white linen stripped from the tables, the crystal glasses collected on rolling carts. The chandelier above was still burning. No one had turned it off, and it threw its fractured light across an empty room that smelled like expensive food and the residue of a night that had tried to become a catastrophe. Roman sat down at the nearest table. He was still in his suit, still immaculate on the outside, the kind of put together that becomes its own kind of dishonesty. He stared at the empty room and let himself, for the first time that night, stop performing. His phone buzzed. 3 messages in rapid succession, all from Dominic's secondary number. He read them. The first said, Hale is not Pacific Corridor. He's in New York. He's been here the entire time. The second said, cross-referencing Hale's name against Alliance records, finding connections we didn't know existed. This goes deeper than the Summit documents. The third said, Valentina was right. This wasn't about tonight. Tonight was just the trigger. Roman read the messages twice. Then he put the phone face down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the linen and breathed. If tonight was just the trigger, then the weapon was still loaded. And somewhere in the building, or the city, or the network of shadows that Conrad Hale had apparently been constructing for years inside his organization, the finger was still on it. He thought about the burner text. He's still in the building. The text that had led them to Marcus. The text that had come from an unknown number. He had assumed it was someone inside his security apparatus, someone who'd noticed something and had the sense to be careful about how they reported it. But his security apparatus was compromised. Marcus had fed information to Hale for 4 years. That meant anything moving through the Castelli communication channels had potentially been visible to Hale's operation. Any loyal member of his security detail who sent a warning internally might have done so, knowing the message could be intercepted. So why send a burner text to Roman's personal number? Only a handful of people had that number. Valentina had that number. He turned the phone over and looked at the message again. 4 words. No signature, no follow-up. He'd been assuming the text was sent to help him find Marcus. That might be wrong. That might be a convenience, a secondary benefit of a message sent for a different reason entirely. What if the text wasn't a tip about Marcus? What if it was a warning about someone else? Roman stood up so fast the chair scraped backward across the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. He was already moving when his phone rang. Dominic. He picked up on the first ring. Tell me, Roman said. Dominic's voice was tight in a way Roman had never heard before. The voice of a man holding something very heavy and running out of strength to carry it. The communication logs Marcus gave us. We've been going through them, cross-referencing the timestamps against building access records for tonight. And Hale's been in contact with someone in the building tonight. Not just Marcus, someone else. Someone with building access who checked in through the main entrance at 11:14 and hasn't checked out. The building. The Imperial Crest Hall, where every criminal dynasty in America had spent the last several hours in the same room, reviewing documents, discussing strategy, revealing to each other, and to anyone listening, the vulnerabilities they normally spent their lives concealing. "Where in the building?" Roman said. The pause before Dominic answered was the longest of the entire night. Sub-basement level, the mechanical infrastructure. "Roman, there are access tunnels down there that connect to every major section of the building. Electrical, HVAC, structural." Roman stopped walking. "And if someone wanted to plant something in those tunnels," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "Something in the structural sections. In the places nobody checks because nobody thinks about them. How long would it take to—" "The building has been active for 6 hours," Dominic said. 6 hours is enough time." The words landed in Roman's chest like the flat of a hand pressed hard against his sternum. Every major criminal leader in America had spent the evening in this building. Marin Delacroix, Victor Yoon, Liang Zheng, Kenji Okamura. All of them in one place for the first time in 3 years. The one night when the entire alliance was in the same structure. The summit had not been the target. The summit was the delivery mechanism. Get every leader in one room, compromise the documents to buy time, keep them in the building long enough to— "Dominic!" Roman was already running. "Get everyone out of this building. Everyone. All staff, all security, all cleaning crews, everybody in this structure. Get them out right now and find Valentina. Find her and get her out first." He heard Dominic already shouting orders before the call ended. Roman took the nearest stairwell and went down. He went down because Valentina was in the basement, and whatever Conrad Hale had planted in the sub-basement tunnels beneath the Imperial Crest Hall, it was still there, and the building was still full of people, and the night that was supposed to end at midnight, the sub-basement smelled like rust and standing water and something else underneath both of those. Something chemical, faint and purposeful, the kind of smell that doesn't belong in a mechanical room and announces itself only to people who know what they're looking for. Roman knew what he was looking for. He hit the bottom of the stairwell at a run and shoved through the fire door into the service corridor. The lighting down here was different from the floors above. Not the flickering fluorescence of the basement offices, but a dull industrial orange, the kind of emergency backup lighting that exists not to help you see clearly, but simply to ensure you can see at all. Everything it touched looked like it was on fire from the inside. He pulled out his phone and tried Dominic. The call connected but broke apart. Concrete and steel and whatever else was packed into the walls of the sub-basement, reducing the signal to fragments. He caught the word evacuating and the word west, and then nothing. He kept moving. The service corridor branched at the first junction, left toward the HVAC infrastructure, right toward the electrical grid. Straight ahead, according to the building schematic he'd forced himself to memorize 11 years ago when his father told him that a man who doesn't know the floor plan of every room he uses regularly is a man who dies in a fire, straight ahead toward the structural tunnels. He went straight. The tunnel was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly touched both walls. Pipes ran overhead, sweating in the cold air, and somewhere ahead, water was dripping with the irregular patience of something that had been dripping for years and would continue dripping long after everything else had changed. Roman moved fast, not running now because running in a space this tight was just controlled falling, but moving with the compressed urgency of a man who has finally understood the stakes and is calculating, even as he moves, whether understanding them this late was understanding them too late. He heard her before he saw her. Valentina's voice, low and clear and utterly without panic, coming from around the bend in the tunnel. "Don't touch the secondary coupling. If it's pressure triggered, contact with the coupling activates it." Roman came around the bend and stopped. The tunnel opened into a utility junction, a small chamber where 4 corridors met, filled with pipe manifolds and junction boxes, and bolted to the structural column at the center of the chamber what appeared at first glance to be a standard electrical housing unit. Black casing, standard dimensions, the kind of thing you'd walk past without registering if you didn't know that standard electrical housing units don't have a digital display on the side counting down from 11 minutes and 40 seconds. 11 minutes and 38 seconds. 11:37. Valentina was crouched in front of it, her blazer off and folded on the floor beside her, her white shirt already dirty at the cuffs from contact with the pipes. She was holding a small flashlight between her teeth and examining the device with her hands held carefully away from it, close enough to read it, far enough to not trigger anything. Beside her, his back against the wall and his face the color of old chalk, was a man Roman didn't recognize. Young, maybe mid-20s, with a split lip and a security uniform that wasn't Castelli black. Lighter, different insignia, the uniform of the Imperial Crest Hall's own building staff. He was holding his left wrist with his right hand, and the left wrist was sitting at an angle that wrists don't naturally sit at. Valentina took the flashlight from her mouth without looking up. Roman, there are 3 more. 3 more what? Devices. This configuration. 1 primary, 3 secondary placed at structural load points. This one is the primary. The secondaries are in the north corridor, the east service shaft, and under the main stairwell foundation. She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The only evidence of anything was the thin line of tension across her jaw, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd been watching someone's face for 11 years. The building has been partially evacuated? Dominic's working on it. Partially isn't evacuated. I know that, Valentina. Then move faster. She turned back to the device. Roman looked at the young man with the broken wrist. Who are you? Building maintenance. His voice was thin with pain. I was doing a late check on the junction room. I tried to stop him from installing the last component, and he gestured at his wrist without moving it. Him who? I don't know. He had a badge. He came through the staff entrance. I'd seen him before on Summit nights. I thought he was... What did he look like? The young man described someone in the utilitarian terms of someone whose brain is mostly occupied with pain. Medium height, older, gray at the temples, quiet. It told Roman nothing except that the person was skilled enough to blend into the building's staff rotation so thoroughly that people who saw him repeatedly couldn't describe him specifically. Conrad Hale's people were good. Of course they were good. Hale had been building this for years. Valentina, Roman crouched beside her. Tell me what you need. I need a wire cutter with insulated handles, a specific gauge I'm guessing you don't have in your jacket pocket, and about 40 minutes I also don't have. She examined the device's underside with the flashlight, and he watched her face in the reflected light, reading the problem, sorting the variables, running the calculations with the same quiet efficiency she'd applied to everything else tonight. What I actually have is 11 minutes, and she checked the display. 14 seconds, 2 hands, and a guess about the trigger architecture. A guess? An educated guess. Based on the secondary coupling placement and the power source configuration, this is a closed-loop pressure system. The countdown is cosmetic. It's there to create urgency if someone finds the device, to prevent calm thinking. The actual trigger isn't time-based. Roman looked at the display. 11 minutes, 9 seconds. Then what's the trigger? Disruption of the loop. Any interference with the primary coupling, cutting it, disconnecting it, attempting to remove the device from the column, completes a circuit that the countdown doesn't control. She paused. The clock is a trick. The real danger is the wiring. Can you bypass it? If I'm right about the architecture, yes. If I'm wrong, we'll know very quickly. Roman stared at her profile. The flashlight, the dirty cuffs, the absolute absence of anything that looked like fear. How do you know any of this? He said. She didn't answer immediately. She was tracing a wire with one finger, not touching it, her fingernail hovering a millimeter from the insulation. Because I've been looking for Conrad Hale for 2 years, she said. The tunnel was very quiet. 2 years, Roman said. Yes. 2 years, and you didn't... I couldn't tell you. She finally looked at him fully, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened, but opened slightly, the way a door opens when the person behind it has finally decided the person on the other side is ready for what's there. Roman, think about what I just told you. I identified an active infiltration operation inside your organization. I started investigating. And as I investigated, I realized that the person running the operation, Hale, Had an information source so close to the center of your world that any discussion of the investigation through normal channels would immediately reach him. I couldn't use your phones, I couldn't use your secure servers, I couldn't use your staff, I couldn't use anyone who had contact with Marcus. She paused. I was investigating a leak by myself because any other approach would have sealed it before I found the source. The math of it assembled itself in Roman's head, and the assembly process was physically unpleasant. She hadn't been keeping secrets from him. She had been protecting the investigation from the leak that ran directly through the center of his operation. Telling Roman would have meant telling Marcus. Telling Marcus meant telling Hale. Telling Hale meant the investigation died and the operation continued, and tonight's summit proceeded as Hale had planned it. 7 families, 1 building, 1 catastrophic ending. She'd worked alone because working alone was the only option that preserved the outcome. And she still hadn't been able to stop it entirely because they were currently in a basement with 11 minutes on a device that could bring the building down. How many people know about Hale? Roman asked. 3. Me. Marin Delacroix. I needed access to Delacroix financial records to trace one of his funding channels, and I couldn't do that without Marin's knowledge. She hesitated. And Dominic. Roman's head came up. Dominic. I brought him in 4 weeks ago. I needed someone inside your security structure who could monitor physical access to the building tonight without going through standard channels. Someone Hale didn't have a line on. She met his eyes. I verified Dominic's communication records going back 2 years before I approached him. He's clean, Roman. He's been clean. Roman thought about Dominic on the landing between floors, telling him they needed Marcus alive. Thought about the way Dominic had gone still when Marcus said Hale's name, not with surprise, but with the specific stillness of a man hearing confirmation of something he already knew and has been carrying alone. Not surprise. Recognition. He'd known. Dominic had known and said nothing, because Valentina had brought him in and Valentina had told him to say nothing until she determined it was time. And Dominic, who had worked for the Castelli family for 30 years, who had bled for it, who Roman had always assumed was his, had deferred to her judgment, because her judgment was better. Roman sat back against the opposite wall of the utility junction and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The ceiling was concrete, pipes, the underside of a building that was still full of people. His hands were steady, which surprised him because everything else, everything invisible, everything inside, was moving in ways he didn't have vocabulary for. Roman. Valentina's voice was different now, still precise, but with something underneath it that he hadn't heard in years. Something that might have been in a different architecture, something close to gentleness. I need you to focus. I'm focused. You're processing. I can do both. Not right now, you can't. Right now, I need you to take your phone and go up 2 levels to where the signal works and call Dominic and tell him the devices are pressure-triggered and loop circuit, not time-based. His people need to know that before they approach the secondary locations. If they try to remove or disrupt the secondaries before they understand the trigger architecture, they will detonate them. Roman was already standing. And you? I'm going to try to interrupt the power source at the base coupling without completing the loop. She turned back to the device. It has about an 82% chance of working. 82. Yes. And the other 18? She picked up the flashlight and put it back between her teeth and didn't answer. Roman went. He took the tunnel at a run, back through the service corridor, up the stairwell, crashing through the fire door at the basement level, where the signal came back in fragments, and then in full. He called Dominic and delivered Valentina's message in 11 words, and he heard Dominic relay it immediately to someone in the field, and then he turned around and went back down. He was not going to stand 2 floors above her and wait for an 82% probability to resolve itself without him in the room. He came back around the bend into the utility junction at a dead run and nearly collided with Valentina, who was standing, blazer back on, briefcase in hand, the device on the structural column behind her dark and silent, the display blank, the countdown gone, the whole machine inert. Roman stopped, looked at the device, looked at her. 82%, he said. 83, actually. I found a cleaner access point. She reached down and helped the young maintenance worker to his feet, steadying him by his good arm. We need to move. The secondaries are still active. They moved. Getting the maintenance worker up the stairs took time neither of them had. Roman took the young man's weight on his left side, and Valentina moved ahead to clear the route. And the three of them came up through the service levels of the Imperial Crest Hall into a building that was in the process of being evacuated in a way that was trying very hard not to look like an evacuation. Dominic's people were skilled. Roman had selected them for exactly this quality. And the guests, staff, and remaining security personnel were moving toward the exits with the guided calm of a crowd, being told there was a minor technical issue rather than the building collapse urgency that the situation actually demanded. Roman handed the maintenance worker to the nearest security man and turned to find Dominic. Dominic found him first. His expression was the expression of a man who has just received information that has changed the shape of the next several hours of his life in a direction he would not have chosen. "The secondary in the east service shaft," Dominic said. "Our people got to it. The one in the north corridor," he paused. "Also handled." "The stairwell foundation?" Dominic's jaw worked. "We have a problem." "Dominic, the operative who planted the devices is still in the building. We found evidence of a fourth device, not the three Valentina identified. A fourth, positioned differently, not structural." Roman looked at him. "It's in the private office suite on the fourth floor," Dominic said, "the one the Delacroix delegation was using." Valentina appeared at Roman's shoulder. She had heard. He could tell by the way her body changed, a barely perceptible shift in posture, a realignment, the kind of physical response that isn't about emotion, but about computation. Her mind was already moving. "Marin," she said. "Marin Delacroix is still in the building," Dominic confirmed. "She refused to evacuate. Said she'd seen too many fake emergencies used as extraction covers for rival operations. She's in the delegation suite with 4 of her people." "Then she's sitting in a room with a device," Roman said. "Yes. And the operative who placed it?" Dominic's expression completed its journey to wherever it had been heading. "Building security found him 12 minutes ago in the 4th floor service corridor. He was already dead." "A beat." "Executed. Single shot, close range, professional placement." Roman stared at him. "Hale killed his own operative after the device was planted, removing the loose end." Dominic met his eyes. "Roman, this was never about the summit documents. It was never about starting a war between families. Hale doesn't want a war between the families. That's manageable. Wars end. Treaties get signed. The alliance heals." He stopped. "Hale wants the alliance gone entirely. He wants the leadership gone, not destabilized, gone. In one night, in one building, while every leader is in the same place at the same time." Valentina's voice was very quiet. "He wants to rebuild from the rubble." Both men looked at her. "If every sitting leader of every major alliance family dies tonight," she said, "the organizations don't dissolve. They fracture into smaller pieces, fighting over territory, fighting over succession. And whoever is positioned to move into that vacuum, whoever has already established relationships with the second-tier leadership, the underbosses, the junior partners who are about to suddenly find themselves running organizations they weren't prepared for," she paused. "That person becomes the most powerful figure in American organized crime without firing a shot. He just has to be ready to step into the space the bodies leave behind." The hallway was very quiet. "He's been preparing for this for years," she said. "The funding channels I traced, the communication networks I found, they weren't for running operations. They were for building relationships, quiet ones, with the people just below the leadership level in every alliance family." Roman looked at her. "He already has control of the next generation. He will, the moment this generation dies." The building around them had gone mostly quiet. The evacuation was nearly complete. The sounds of moving crowds replaced by the echo of empty corridors and the distant percussion of Dominic's security teams working through the remaining areas. The Imperial Crest Hall, which had been full of the most dangerous people in America 6 hours ago, was almost empty. Almost. Marin Delacroix was on the 4th floor with a device she didn't know about and a dead man in the corridor outside her door who'd put it there. And somewhere, in the building, in the city, in the network of shadows he'd spent 15 years constructing, Conrad Hale was watching. Roman looked at Valentina. "Can you handle the device in Marin's suite? I need to see it first. If it's the same architecture as the primary downstairs, yes. If Hale designed it differently," she stopped. "I need to see it." "Then let's go." He started moving. Valentina fell into step beside him. Dominic flanked them both, and the three of them moved through the emptying corridors of the Imperial Crest Hall toward the elevator bank. And Roman was aware, in the way you become aware of things when everything else has been stripped away, that the three of them moving together like this was the first time in 11 years that he and Valentina had been moving in the same direction, at the same speed, toward the same destination. He was aware that this should not have required a building full of explosives to produce. He was aware, and he filed it away, and he kept moving. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, and they stepped out into a corridor where the air was wrong. Not in a way you could smell, not yet, but in the way that spaces feel wrong when something has happened in them recently that the walls haven't finished absorbing. The lights were on, the carpet was clean, the door to the Delacroix delegation suite was closed, and from behind it came the low sound of voices. Dominic raised a fist. They stopped. From the service corridor to their left came a sound. Small. Specific. The sound of a door being opened carefully by someone who did not want to be heard. Roman turned. At the end of the service corridor, 20 feet away, a figure stepped out of the shadows and stopped. Not running, not hiding. Standing with the deliberate stillness of someone who had calculated the encounter in advance and chosen to be seen. He was older than Roman had expected. Late 50s, perhaps. Gray at the temples, as the maintenance worker had described, but the rest of him was not the forgettable middle management figure that description had implied. He was lean in the way of someone who maintains it deliberately, and he stood with the posture of a man who has spent a long time in rooms where posture communicates everything that words don't. His eyes moved from Roman to Valentina, and when they reached Valentina, they stopped. Not with surprise. With something closer to respect. The specific respect of one professional for another. The acknowledgement of a worthy opponent delivered without warmth and without regret. "Mrs. Castelli," Conrad Hale said. His voice was even, low, without any of the theatrical quality that Roman would have expected from a man who had just spent the evening trying to kill everyone in a building. "You found the primary faster than I expected. You underestimated the access point geometry," Valentina said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Your coupling placement assumed a specific approach angle. I came at it from the secondary manifold." "I see that now." Hale tilted his head slightly. "I won't make that mistake again." "No," she said. "You won't." Something in the way she said it made Roman look at her. Her hand had moved to the outside pocket of her blazer, a gesture so small and so casual that in any other context he would not have registered it. He registered it now. He registered what it meant. He registered the fact that she had arrived at the Imperial Crest Hall tonight with a briefcase full of documents and a prepared knowledge of every critical system in the building, and apparently something in the pocket of her blazer that she had not discussed with him. Hale registered it too. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes. He looked at Valentina's hand at her pocket. He looked at her face. He looked at Roman, and then he looked back at Valentina, and whatever calculation was running behind those careful eyes completed itself, and the conclusion it reached was visible in the single, almost imperceptible change in his posture. The shift of weight, the adjustment of balance, the body's unconscious preparation for a geometry that had just changed. "You've been closer than I knew," he said. 2 years, she said. "You should have moved sooner." "I needed you in the building." She took one step forward. Roman stayed where he was, because some instinct, new, poorly understood, but insistent, told him that this moment belonged to her, and that inserting himself into it would be the same category of mistake he'd been making for 11 years. "I needed every piece of your network visible before I shut it down. Moving sooner would have cost me the full picture." Hale was quiet for a moment. "The 4th device," he said. "You know about it. 4th floor, Delacroix suite, junction panel behind the east wall. You haven't disarmed it. Not yet. Then we have a conversation." "We do." She stopped walking. They were 10 feet apart. The service corridor was narrow and badly lit and smelled like the dead man whose body Roman realized was somewhere behind the door Hale had emerged from. "Tell me the rest of the network. The secondary contacts, the underbosses." "In exchange for what?" "I disarmed the device in the Delacroix suite without removing your ability to walk out of this building." Hale studied her. "And him?" He didn't look at Roman when he said it, kept his eyes on Valentina as if Roman were a variable in a problem that Valentina controlled the solution to. That landed somewhere in Roman's chest that was already raw and damaged from everything else the night had put there. Him, Valentina said, without looking back at Roman, is not part of the negotiation. Hale said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly, visibly, with the exaggerated care of a man demonstrating that the movement is not a threat, and produced a phone. He looked at it. Then he held it out toward Valentina. "Everything I have is on this device," he said. "Contacts, funding channels, operational records, 15 years of work." He paused. "It's encrypted. You'll need the key." "Give me the key. I'll give it to you when I'm outside the building." Valentina looked at the phone. Roman watched her face and saw the calculation running. Not whether to trust Hale, because trusting Hale was not part of the architecture of this conversation, but whether the offer was structured in a way that served her objective. Whether letting Hale walk bought more than stopping him here. She reached out and took the phone. "The Delacroix suite," she said. "Tell me the specific placement." Hale told her. "Location, coupling type, trigger architecture. 4 sentences, precise and complete. The information of a man who was either honoring a deal or had already moved beyond the deal to the next move in a game that Roman still couldn't see all the way to the end of." Valentina listened, nodded once, turned to Dominic and relayed the technical information in 10 words. Then she looked back at Hale. "Go," she said. Hale looked at her for one more second. That look. Roman would think about it later, in the weeks that followed, trying to parse what was in it. Not admiration, exactly. Something more complex and less comfortable than admiration. The look of a man who has spent 15 years building something and is watching it be disassembled by the one person he should have taken more seriously, much earlier. Then he turned and walked back into the service corridor. Dominic's hand moved toward his weapon. "No," Valentina said. Dominic stopped. "We let him go?" Roman said. "We let him go with a phone that I've been monitoring for 6 weeks. She turned and walked toward the elevator. "Every contact he reaches out to tonight will be visible to me in real time. Every network node he activates trying to salvage the operation will identify itself." She pressed the button for the 4th floor. "He thinks he's leaving with leverage. He's leaving with a tracking device and a list of every person he trusts enough to call in a crisis." Roman stared at her back. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. He followed. Dominic followed. The doors closed. In the small mirrored space of the elevator, Roman looked at Valentina's reflection. Her face was still composed. Still the controlled, precise expression she'd worn all night, through interrogations and explosives and negotiations and revelations that would have broken most people at the first hour. But in the reflection, in the slightly softer quality of mirror light, he could see what the direct view obscured, the color that wasn't quite in her cheeks. The way she was holding herself, not rigid, but careful, the careful posture of someone managing something physical that they are not going to mention. "You're hurt," he said. Her reflection didn't react. "I'm fine." "Valentina, I caught a pipe coupling on the way out of the primary junction. It's superficial." She met his eyes in the mirror. "It doesn't matter right now. It matters to Roman." She said his name with the same precision she applied to everything, but this time underneath the precision was something that had been worn thin by too many hours of being the only person who fully understood the situation. "There is a device 40 feet above us in a room where Marin Delacroix is sitting. There will be time for everything else. Not right now." The elevator stopped on the 4th floor. The doors opened. She walked out and he followed, and somewhere in the sub-basement below them, the primary device sat inert on its structural column. And somewhere in the city, Conrad Hale was making his first phone call on a phone that Valentina had owned for 6 weeks. And somewhere in the Imperial Crest Hall, a dead operative was cooling in a service corridor, and Roman Castelli was walking 3 steps behind his wife toward a room that might or might not be about to become the last room either of them entered, understanding for the first time with absolute and devastating clarity that the empire he thought he'd built had always had exactly one load-bearing wall, and he had spent 11 years trying to replace her with people who couldn't even see what she was holding. The door to the Delacroix suite was heavy oak with brass hardware that had been polished so many times it had lost its edges. Valentina knocked twice, not the knock of someone asking permission, but the knock of someone announcing an arrival that is going to happen regardless of the answer. Marin Delacroix opened it herself. Her 4 security men were visible behind her in the suite's main room, positioned at the windows and corners with the practiced stillness of people who had been waiting for something to happen and had decided that waiting was its own form of action. Marin looked at Valentina, then at Roman, then at the corridor behind them where Dominic stood with 2 of his own people. "Tell me," Marin said. "There's a device in your junction panel," Valentina said. "East wall. We have the technical parameters. I need to access it now." Marin stepped back without another word. The suite was a large room with high ceilings and the kind of furniture that costs enough to signal importance without being vulgar about it. The east wall had a built-in bookcase on one side and a recessed panel on the other, the kind of access point that exists in old buildings to allow maintenance crews to reach the electrical infrastructure without tearing open the plaster. The panel had a simple latch. Nothing about it suggested it had been touched recently. Valentina crossed the room, set her briefcase on the nearest chair, and crouched in front of the panel. She opened the latch. Inside, behind the standard junction box and the wiring that belonged there, was something that didn't. Same black casing as the primary downstairs. Smaller, designed for a different purpose, not structural collapse, but something more targeted. Something that would take out this room and the 2 adjacent to it and everyone inside them. Roman looked at it and felt his stomach drop 6 inches. Valentina examined it for 45 seconds without touching it. Her breathing was controlled, measured, the breathing of someone who has trained themselves out of the instinct to hold their breath in dangerous situations because held breath degrades fine motor control. Roman knew this because she had explained it to him once, years ago, during a conversation he had half listened to because he'd been looking at his phone. He remembered it now. He remembered it with the specific acuity of someone who has just understood that everything they half listened to was load-bearing. "Same architecture as the primary," she said. "Different access point. Hale gave me accurate information." "Why?" Marin said from across the room. "Because the phone I have is more valuable to him than Marin Delacroix's life," Valentina said without looking up. "He's cutting losses. The operation is compromised. He's moving to salvage the network." She reached into her blazer pocket and produced a small multi-tool. Compact, precise, the kind of instrument that doesn't belong in an evening's blazer pocket unless someone put it there on purpose before leaving for an event they expected to get complicated. Everyone back to the far wall. They moved. Roman didn't move. "You too," she said. "No." She looked up at him. In the low light of the recessed panel, her face was all shadows and concentration, the injury on her side pulling at her posture in a way she was managing but couldn't entirely conceal. Her eyes met his and held them for 3 seconds. The assessment, the calculation, the acceptance of a variable she hadn't planned for. "Then don't talk," she said. "I won't." She turned back to the device. Roman crouched beside her, close enough to see what she was doing, far enough not to interfere with it. His shoulder was 6 inches from hers. He could feel the warmth of her through the fabric between them, or thought he could, which might have been the same thing. He watched her hands, steady, precise, moving with a deliberateness that was not slowness, but the absence of any wasted motion. The economy of someone who understands that in this context, efficiency and survival are the same word. She found the access point at the base coupling, identical to the primary. She positioned the multi-tool. Her right hand was completely steady. Her left, braced against the panel housing, had a faint tremor. The side with the injury, the muscle protesting the sustained, controlled position. Roman put his left hand flat against the panel beside hers. Not touching her, just there. Something to brace against, if she needed it, if she wanted it. She didn't look at him. But after a moment, her left hand shifted slightly, redistributing the brace point, using the panel surface he'd stabilized as part of her support structure. She worked 90 seconds. Roman counted them without meaning to, the numbers running through his head as a way of organizing time into something manageable. At 60, her jaw tightened. At 75, she exhaled once, sharp and short, and repositioned the tool by a fraction of a degree. At 88, something clicked. The display went dark. She held position for 5 more seconds. 5 seconds of absolute stillness, both of them not breathing, the room behind them not breathing. And then she sat back on her heels and let the multi-tool rest in her palm and exhaled slowly through her nose. Done, she said. The room behind them exhaled collectively. Roman's hand was still flat against the panel. He moved it. He became aware that his knees were aching from the crouch, and that at some point in the last 90 seconds he had started sweating in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Marin Delacroix crossed the room in 5 steps and crouched in front of Valentina with the flexibility of a woman who keeps herself in condition because her profession occasionally requires it. She looked at the inert device. Then she looked at Valentina. 3 devices, Marin said, all neutralized. 4, the primary was in the sub-basement. Marin was quiet for a moment. And the man responsible. In the city, we're tracking him. We. Marin's eyes moved to Roman for the first time since they'd entered the suite. The look she gave him was the look from the ballroom. The rattlesnake assessing the threat level of something in its territory. But with a layer on top of it now, that was more complicated. Not warmer. Just more complicated. You're tracking him together. Yes, Roman said. Marin looked back at Valentina. How long before you have his full network? 6 to 12 hours, depending on how quickly he starts making contact. Valentina stood. The movement cost her something. Roman saw it in the micro-expression that crossed her face and was gone, the physical tax of an injury being managed past its comfortable limit. But she stood straight, and she did it without using the wall or the panel or him. Marin, I need you out of this building. I'm aware. I mean now. Marin looked at her for one more second. Then she turned to her security detail and said 2 words, just 2, and they were moving before the second one finished. The delegation collected itself with the efficient compression of people accustomed to rapid relocation, and within 4 minutes the Delacroix contingent was in the corridor and heading for the elevator, and Marin was the last one out, pausing at the door to look back at Roman one final time. Take care of that, she said. She wasn't pointing at the building or the device or anything in the room. She was looking at Valentina. Roman understood her. I know, he said. Marin left. The suite was empty now except for the 3 of them, Roman, Valentina, Dominic, who had reappeared in the doorway with the quiet materialization that had characterized his movements all night. The lifetime habit of a man who positions himself at the edge of situations so he can see all exits simultaneously. Dominic's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression changed. Not dramatically, not the way a civilian's face changes when news arrives, but in the contained way his face always changed, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in the set of his mouth. Hale made his first call, Dominic said, 17 minutes after leaving the building. Valentina held out her hand. Dominic brought her his phone. She read the screen and Roman watched her face read it, watched the information land and be processed and incorporated into whatever architecture she was building in real time. He called a man named Steele Rourke, she said, Pittsburgh, underboss for the Hargrove Network's northern operation. She scrolled. They spoke for 4 minutes. Hale told him the primary operation was compromised, but the secondary network was intact. He said, she paused, reading. He said the transition timeline moves forward 60 days. 60 days to what? Roman said. To whatever he planned to do once the Alliance leadership was gone. She handed the phone back to Dominic. He doesn't know the summit failed yet. He knows his people in the building are dead or captured. He knows I have the phone. But he doesn't know that I've been in the phone's communication architecture for 6 weeks. He thinks he handed me a data storage device. He doesn't know it's a live feed. Roman stared at her. He thinks he played you. He thinks I took this deal at face value. Something moved across her face. Not quite satisfaction, nothing that uncomplicated, but the look of a person who has spent a long time setting something up and is watching it operate exactly as designed. He's wrong. Dominic's phone buzzed again and again, a rapid succession that made all 3 of them go still. Dominic read the screen. His face did the thing it had done in the corridor hours earlier, the controlled containment of something large and fast-moving. 5 more calls, he said, all within the last 3 minutes. Rourke is making contact down the chain. The network is activating. How many nodes? Valentina said. We're seeing. Dominic was scrolling fast now, his thick fingers moving across the screen with unexpected precision. 14 distinct contact points so far. Chicago, Boston, Atlanta, Houston. 1 in Miami, 2 in Los Angeles. All underboss level? Or below? the tier just beneath the Alliance leadership, exactly where you said he'd built the relationships. Valentina closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, she looked at Roman. We have a window. While the network is active and making contact, every node is visible. If we move now, tonight, we can map the entire secondary structure before Hale realizes the phone is a liability and cuts contact. And if we wait, he'll figure it out. He's good, Roman. He built 15 years of infrastructure under our noses. He'll realize the phone is compromised within... She checked the time on Dominic's device. 4 hours. Maybe 5 if he's rattled. After that, he goes dark and we lose most of the network. Roman looked at her. What do you need? I need access to the Alliance communication channels. Every family. I need to push data to their security operations simultaneously so they can identify and isolate the compromised underbosses before Hale gets word to them to go quiet. She paused. And I need you to make the calls. Me. You're still the head of the Castelli family. You're still the name they recognize as the authority behind this summit. I can prepare everything. The data packages, the technical briefings, the identification parameters for each compromised node. But the calls that authorize action in 7 different organizations have to come from someone with standing. She held his gaze. That's you. Roman was quiet for 3 seconds. He had spent 11 years believing that his name was the machine, that the Castelli authority was the engine that made everything run. Tonight had comprehensively dismantled that belief and rebuilt it into something smaller and more accurate. Not that his name was worthless, but that his name without her work behind it was a flag without a flagpole, fabric, nothing more. Nothing. And she was standing in front of him, injured, having spent a night that would have broken most people in most professions, handing him back his authority and telling him to use it. Not because she couldn't, because it would work better coming from him, and she was too precise to let ego interfere with effectiveness. Tell me what to say, he said. They worked. The next 2 hours were the most concentrated work Roman Castelli had ever done in his life. Valentina sat at the desk in the Delacroix suite with her laptop, which had materialized from the briefcase because of course it had, and Dominic's device and the compromised phone, building the data packages with a speed that suggested she had been preparing the framework for this eventuality for some time. Roman made calls. 7 families, their security heads, their operations directors. He spoke the words Valentina passed him on a notepad. Concise, precise, technically specific. And he delivered them with the authority of his name and the weight of the night behind him, and the understanding, new and raw and real, that every word he spoke was built on a foundation she'd constructed. The responses came back fast. The Alliance families were shaken, activated, and ready. 3 of the 14 compromised underbosses were in custody within the first 40 minutes, 5 more by the end of the first hour. By the time the second hour completed, Dominic had confirmation of 11 total isolations and intelligence packages on the remaining 3 that would allow their respective families to move on them at first light. Hale's network was collapsing in real time. Roman was on the phone with Victor Yoon's operations director when Dominic touched his arm. He held up 2 fingers, 2 minutes, and finished the call. Dominic's face told him something had changed. Hale stopped making calls 40 minutes ago, Dominic said. He's figured out the phone. How much of the network did we get? 11 confirmed, 3 pending. The last 3 are going to require physical operations, surveillance, approach, the full process. It'll take a few days. Dominic paused. But the architecture is broken. Even if those 3 go dark successfully, they're isolated. There's nothing connecting them to each other anymore. Hale can't coordinate them without the network, and the network is gone. Roman exhaled. The suite was quiet. Valentina was still at the desk, the laptop open, working through something. He couldn't see what, but the quality of her concentration had changed from the urgent compression of the last 2 hours to something more methodical, more deliberate. The kind of concentration that indicates the crisis phase has passed and the documentation phase has begun. She was writing everything down. Every node, every contact, every piece of the network they'd uncovered tonight. Creating the record that would make what happened actionable, prosecutable, permanent in the institutional memory of the Alliance. She was still working. He crossed the room and stood beside the desk, looked down at the screen. Dense paragraphs, technical notations, timestamps. The architecture of 15 years of Hale's infrastructure being mapped and recorded by the person who'd spent 2 years hunting it. Val, he said quietly. She held up one finger without looking up. He waited. She finished the sentence she was writing, saved the document, and sat back. Is it enough? He said. She looked at the screen. For the network? Yes. For Hale himself. She shook her head slightly. He's in the city. We know he's in the city because the calls came from New York area towers. But he's careful, and he's fast, and he knows we have the phone now. So he goes to ground. He goes to ground, she said, and in 6 months or a year he surfaces somewhere else and starts rebuilding. Roman looked at her. Unless we find him before he goes to ground. She met his eyes. The injury was showing now, not dramatically, but in the accumulated weight of the night in her face, the slight pallor underneath her composure, the careful way she'd been sitting for the last hour that favored her left side. He came to the building tonight personally. That was ego. He wanted to see it happen. People who want to see it happen have a place they go afterward, a place where they feel safe enough to watch the outcome. You know where it is. I have a location that appeared in the phone's data 3 times in the last 6 weeks. A property in the meatpacking district registered to a logistics company that doesn't exist. It could be nothing. It could be a safe house he's already abandoned. She paused. Or it could be where he goes when operations go wrong and he needs to assess damage and decide next steps. Roman straightened. Then that's where we go. Roman, Valentina. He said her name the way she said things, once, precise, with the expectation that it would carry the weight he put into it. He came to the building to watch it fall. His whole operation just collapsed in 2 hours. The network is gone. The summit survived. Every leader he planned to kill tonight is alive and now knows his name. He looked at her. Where does a man go when 15 years of work dies in one night? She was quiet. He goes somewhere familiar, Roman said. Somewhere he's been when things went wrong before. Somewhere the walls know him. Valentina held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she reached for the laptop. Get Dominic, she said. Roman crossed the suite in 6 steps. Dominic was in the corridor on his phone, his back to the wall and his eyes on the elevator. Roman said his name once. Dominic looked up. Something in Roman's face communicated everything necessary. Dominic ended his call. They moved. The Imperial Crest Hall's main entrance was quiet. The evacuated building had not yet been cleared for return, and the street outside was the particular stillness of a Manhattan block at 4 a.m. Not empty, because Manhattan is never empty, but operating on a different frequency, the city's nocturnal skeleton visible beneath the daytime flesh. 2 black vehicles were waiting at the curb, Dominic's standing arrangement. They crossed the sidewalk and got in. Valentina had the laptop open in the back seat. The logistics company property address loaded on the screen. The building schematics she'd pulled from public records open in an adjacent window. She was briefing Dominic's 2 field operatives in the front seat in the clipped technical shorthand of someone who doesn't waste time on preamble. Roman sat beside her. The vehicle moved. The city passed outside the windows. Empty storefronts, streetlights reflected in wet pavement, a taxi moving parallel to them for half a block before turning away. Roman watched the city and felt, for the first time all night, the specific exhaustion that arrives only after sustained adrenaline. Not tiredness, but the body's accounting of everything it has spent. He had been in boardrooms and back rooms and rooms with bad lighting and worse intentions for 11 years. He had made decisions that cost people things they couldn't recover. He had inherited a name and spent a decade deciding that inheriting it was the same as earning it, and tonight had taken that comfortable lie apart with surgical precision and left him holding the pieces. He looked at Valentina beside him, the laptop light on her face, her voice quiet and steady and comprehensive as she briefed the operatives. The injury was pulling at her posture. She wasn't going to mention it. She was going to work through it the way she'd worked through everything, by deciding it was not the most important thing in the room and proceeding accordingly. He thought about 11 years of her deciding that, about every meeting she'd taken, every crisis she'd absorbed, every invisible action that had kept his empire from consuming itself, performed by a woman he had categorized as decorative and handed files and walked away from. The vehicle stopped. The meatpacking district building was 4 stories of converted industrial space, the kind that got absorbed into the premium real estate market 2 decades ago and still wore its origins in the bones. Wide windows, exposed loading dock infrastructure, the ghost of its commercial past underneath the expensive renovation. The lights on the third floor were on. Someone was up there. Dominic looked at Roman. How do you want to do this? Roman looked at the building. Then he looked at Valentina. She was already looking at him. The laptop was closed. The briefing was done. The field operatives had their parameters. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared, because that was how she operated. You prepared everything that could be prepared, and then you moved toward the thing that couldn't. Together, Roman said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't directed at Dominic. He said it looking at Valentina, and she held his gaze for a moment that carried the weight of everything the night had put between them, and everything the 11 years before it had failed to. Then she opened the door. They crossed the street. The building's service entrance was on the north side, a heavy door that had been relocked with a mechanism that was better than the original, the kind of upgrade that suggests the occupant values exit options. One of Dominic's operatives had it open in 90 seconds. They went in. The interior smelled like old concrete and new money, and the specific chemical neutrality of a space that has been professionally cleaned of personality. Stairs on the left, elevator on the right, the light on the third floor visible through the stairwell window. They took the stairs. Roman's heartbeat was very loud in his own ears. Not from exertion. 3 flights of stairs at a controlled pace didn't account for it. It was the sound of everything that had been building since midnight, compressed into the rhythm of a body that understood, even when the mind was still processing, that the next few minutes were going to be the thing all the other minutes had been moving toward. Third floor landing, a single corridor, 4 doors. Light under the second door on the left. Dominic positioned his operatives. Roman put his hand on the door, flat, feeling the surface the way he'd felt the office door in the basement hours earlier, with the same purposeful delay. But different now. Different because last time he'd been performing certainty. This time he had something actual underneath it. He looked at Valentina, standing to his left, and she gave him nothing. No nod, no signal, no performed readiness. Just her presence. Just the fact of her being there, which had always been enough even when he was too blind to know it. Roman opened the door. Conrad Hale was standing at the window. He was looking at the city, the pre-dawn Manhattan skyline visible through the industrial glass, the darkness beginning to separate itself into gradations of blue at the eastern edge. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his back to the door, and he didn't turn when they entered, which meant either he hadn't heard them, or he had, and had decided that turning was not going to change what came next. The room was sparse. A table with a laptop, 2 phones, a glass of water that was half empty. A jacket hung over the back of a chair. The detritus of a man who had not been in this space long enough to accumulate presence. Roman crossed the room. Dominic stayed at the door. The operatives flanked. Valentina moved to Roman's left, and the 3 of them, Roman, Valentina, Dominic at the perimeter, formed the geometry of the confrontation that the entire night had been building toward. Hell turned. He looked at Roman first, then at Valentina. His face was older than it had appeared in the service corridor. The building's fluorescent orange had concealed something that the lamp in this room revealed. The weight of the night was in his face too, but differently. Not exhaustion. Something closer to the particular devastation of a man watching the longest project of his life. Conrad Hale looked like a man who had already done the math. That was the first thing Roman noticed. Not fear, not defiance, not the theatrical composure of someone performing courage under pressure. Just the flat, exhausted arithmetic of a person who has run every remaining calculation and arrived at the same answer from every direction. He stood at the window with his hands loose at his sides, the city behind him beginning its slow crawl toward dawn. And he looked at the 3 of them with the eyes of a man who understood exactly what the room contained and had decided that understanding it was the only dignity left available to him. 15 years, he said. Not to Roman. To Valentina. She didn't respond. I want you to know that. His voice was level, stripped of the professional evenness it had carried in the service corridor. This was what was underneath that, raw and more honest. 15 years. And you took it apart in one night. I took it apart in 2 years, Valentina said. Tonight was just the last part. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the muscle memory of an expression that belonged to a different version of the same man. I should have taken you seriously earlier. Yes, she said, you should have. Roman moved further into the room. His body was tired in the specific way of someone who has been running on compressed urgency for hours, and is now, with the target finally in front of him, feeling the accumulated weight of everything spent to get here. His legs were solid, his hands were steady, but underneath all of that was the particular ache of a night that had dismantled and rebuilt him in ways he hadn't finished accounting for. Sit down, Roman said. Hale sat. He chose the chair nearest the table, the one with his jacket hanging on it, and he sat in it with the deliberate care of a man who has decided that every remaining action will be intentional. No sudden movements, no last calculations about exits or angles or odds. The odds were done. Roman pulled the other chair from the table and sat across from him. The table between them held the laptop, the two phones, the half-empty glass of water. The detritus of a man who had come here to assess damage and had run out of time to finish the assessment. Tell me why, Roman said. Hale looked at him. You want the history. I want the reason. They're the same thing. Hale leaned back in the chair. The lamp beside him threw a hard shadow across half his face, leaving the other half in the flat pre-dawn light coming through the window. Your father, Roman, Enzo Castelli. Do you know what he did to the Hale operation in 2009? Roman said nothing. He knew his father had been ruthless. He knew the shape of that ruthlessness in general terms, the way you know the shape of a mountain without having climbed it. The specific geography he had never bothered to learn. He absorbed it, Hale said. Not destroyed. Absorbed. He took everything my father built, 20 years of work, every contact, every territory, every relationship, and he folded it into the Castelli structure and erased the name. My father died 18 months later. Heart failure, the doctors said. The pause was brief and without performance. The Castelli organization held every debt my father owed, collected every one. There was nothing left. Roman held his gaze. So this was revenge. This was reclamation. Hale's voice sharpened. The first edge in it all night, the place where the arithmetic gave way to something older and less rational. I spent 15 years rebuilding what your father took. Not just the money, the structure, the relationships, the standing. And I built it inside your organization, using your resources, your infrastructure, your people. And you never noticed, because men like you never notice what's underneath you. You stand on top of something and call it yours and never look down. The words landed in Roman's chest in a place that was already bruised from the night's earlier impacts. He felt Valentina's presence to his left, still, attentive, reading the room the way she read everything. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Hale. You could have rebuilt it separately, Roman said. You could have built your own operation from the ground up. 15 years of the work you described. You could have had something real. I could have had something small, Hale said. Something that existed in the margins of what your family controls. Another operation scratching for territory at the edges of an alliance that would have crushed me the moment I became inconvenient. He leaned forward. I didn't want the margins, Roman. I wanted what was taken. And the only way to get it back was to take everything, level the structure, start over with the pieces. With yourself at the top. With the people I'd built relationships with over 15 years. The next generation. The ones who were going to inherit the organizations anyway, eventually. I just accelerated the timeline. Roman was quiet for a moment. He looked at the laptop on the table. How many of them knew what you were planning? None of them knew the full picture. Each one knew only what was relevant to them. A business relationship, a private agreement, a financial arrangement. They weren't co-conspirators. They were resources. And Marcus Viel. Hale's expression shifted. Something that might have been, in a different man at a different hour, the closest thing to regret available. Marcus came to me. Not the other way around. He was dissatisfied. Underpaid for what he did, which was considerable. He found me through a channel I'd left open intentionally. I knew someone inside the Castelli structure would eventually decide they deserved more than they were getting. I just waited. Roman absorbed that. The image of Marcus, 9 years, 3 feet outside his office door, coffee at exactly the right temperature, assembled itself one more time and then dissolved. He let it dissolve. There was nothing useful in holding it. The devices, Roman said, if they'd gone off. The leaders of 7 families. Dead, Hale said simply. The alliance structure collapses. The organizations fracture along succession lines. My people, the underbosses, the next tier, step into the vacuum already knowing each other, already having established relationships, already positioned to consolidate rather than fragment. He looked at Roman with the expression of someone explaining something they spent years designing, the professional pride of it impossible to entirely suppress even now. It would have worked. It didn't work. No. Hale looked at Valentina. It didn't work. Dominic moved from the doorway. Roman heard him, the quiet step, the positioning, and held up one hand without turning around. Dominic stopped. You built something real, Roman said to Hale. Whatever I think about what you used it for, you built it. 15 years of patience and precision inside an organization that should have found you in the first 2. He paused. My father took something from yours? That's true. Whether it justifies what you tried to do tonight, that's a different question, and I'm not going to answer it for you, but I want you to understand something. Hale waited. It still didn't work, Roman said. Not because I stopped it. I didn't stop it. She did. He didn't gesture toward Valentina. He didn't need to. The room understood. So whatever story you've been telling yourself for 15 years about the Castelli name and what it represents and what it cost your family, the name didn't beat you. The work beat you. The invisible, unrecognized, uncredited work that I was too arrogant to see and you were too confident to account for. Hale looked at him, then at Valentina, then back at Roman. Is this the part where you tell me what happens next? This is the part where she does, Roman said. He leaned back and looked at Valentina. She stepped forward. She moved to the table and stood at its edge, not sitting, not performing authority, simply occupying the space with the matter-of-fact certainty that had characterized every moment of her presence tonight. She looked at Hale the way she'd looked at the device in the junction panel, with complete attention and without anything wasted on emotion. Your network is gone, she said. 11 of your 14 secondary contacts are already isolated. The remaining 3 will be located within 72 hours. The funding channels have been documented and will be communicated to the relevant financial authorities through channels that don't require explaining how we know what we know. She paused. The Alliance will decide collectively what accountability looks like for the operation you ran tonight. That conversation will happen at the summit when it reconvenes. And until then, Hale said, until then, you'll be held by people I trust, not Castelli people, Alliance people, a neutral party that each family has approved. She folded her hands on the table. You'll be kept safe. You won't be harmed, and you'll answer every question asked of you completely and accurately, because the alternative is that I release what I have to the 7 families individually and let each of them respond to the attempt on their leadership's lives in whatever way they see fit. Hale looked at her. And you think I'll cooperate? I think you're a practical man who has spent 15 years making practical decisions. I think you understand that the version of this where you cooperate ends with you alive, and the version where you don't ends in a way that doesn't. She held his gaze. I also think that somewhere underneath everything you built and everything you tried to do tonight, you know that the debt you were trying to collect was real. Your father lost something real. That doesn't make tonight right, but it makes it human, and human things can be addressed through human processes. The room was very quiet. Hale looked at Valentina for a long time. Whatever he saw in her face, Roman couldn't read it from his angle, could only read Hale's response to it. Settled something in the older man that had been unsettled since they walked through the door. All right, Hale said. It was 2 words, small words, but they carried the weight of 15 years laying themselves down. Dominic moved forward. Hale stood without being told, and the 2 operatives flanked him, and he walked out of the room without looking back at the window or the city or the laptop on the table or any of the remaining pieces of the operation he'd spent half his life constructing. The door closed. Roman and Valentina were alone in the room for the first time all night. The silence was different from the silences that had preceded it, not the silence of a building full of people holding their breath, Not the silence of a corridor after a revelation, not the silence of a stairwell counting down. This was the silence of a room after everything has already happened, when the event is finished and what remains is only the people who lived through it. Roman looked at the window. The city beyond it was changing, the darkness separating into layers, the eastern sky beginning to show the first gray suggestion of morning in the way that a gray suggestion was all that ever arrived in Manhattan, filtered and diluted by the accumulated light of 8 million lives. He heard Valentina move. He turned. She had sat down, not in the chair Hale had occupied, but on the edge of the table itself, which was the first entirely informal thing he had seen her do all night. And something about the informality of it, the slight slump in her shoulders, the way she put one hand flat on the table surface beside her and let it take some of her weight, made the night suddenly visible on her in a way it hadn't been before. The composed efficiency that had carried her through the last 12 hours was still there, but underneath it, the human cost of it was finally allowed to surface. She was exhausted. She was hurt. She had spent 2 years hunting a man who was trying to kill everyone she'd spent 11 years protecting, and she had done it alone and in secret and without acknowledgement from the person whose organization she was protecting. And tonight she had walked into a building with 4 explosive devices and a network of compromised insiders and had dismantled all of it by herself, with a multi-tool she'd put in her pocket before she left the house. Roman crossed the room and stood in front of her. She looked up at him. Her face was open in a way it almost never was. Not soft, not vulnerable in the performed sense, but genuinely without its armor, the way faces are at 5 in the morning after nights like this one, when there's nothing left to protect and no performance left to give. "You need a doctor," he said. "I know. Tonight." "I know, Roman." He pulled the other chair close and sat down so they were at eye level. He didn't know what he was going to say. He hadn't prepared it. Preparation was what he did when he wanted to control outcomes, and he understood now, in a way he hadn't 24 hours ago, that some outcomes couldn't be controlled, could only be arrived at honestly or not at all. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know that. I know that whatever I say tonight is insufficient for 11 years of what I didn't say and didn't do and didn't see." He looked at his hands, then back at her face. "I'm not going to list the things I got wrong, because the list is the length of the marriage, and saying it all out loud tonight doesn't help either of us. But I need you to hear one thing." She waited. "I saw you tonight. Actually, saw you. Not the version of you I decided you were. Not the background, not the support structure, not the thing that kept the house from falling down while I walked through it taking credit for the architecture." He paused. "I saw you, and I don't know how to say adequately what it cost me to understand how late that is. How much it cost you that it took this long." Valentina looked at him. The expression on her face was not the one he'd expected, not the cold assessment she'd applied to most of their interactions tonight, not the professional composure, not anger or satisfaction or any of the things he might have anticipated. It was something quieter and more final than all of those. "I know you see me now," she said. "I believe that." She paused. "Roman, I have to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond." "Okay, I'm leaving." The words fell into the quiet room and sat there. Roman looked at her. His first instinct, the one that had governed 11 years of reflexive response to things that threatened his sense of the world's arrangement, was to argue, to marshal the case, to apply the same compressed authority he applied to everything that wasn't going the way he'd decided it should go. He didn't. He sat still. He listened, the way she'd asked him to. "Not because of tonight," she said. "Not because of Nadia or the lawyer or the summit. Those things are real, but they're symptoms, not the cause." She looked at the window, at the city going gray outside it. "I have spent 11 years making myself indispensable to a structure that never once asked if the structure was what I wanted. I held it together because I believed in what it could be, the alliance, the stability, the possibility of an underworld that didn't run entirely on blood and betrayal. I still believe in that. I'm going to keep working toward it." She looked back at him. "But I'm going to do it my way, on my terms. Not as your wife, not under your name, not in the space you leave behind when you're done with a room." Roman was quiet for a long time. "You built the alliance," he said. More than anyone in it, including every leader who was in that ballroom tonight. You built it. Yes, and you're going to keep running it. I'm going to transform it. An independent council, not attached to any single family, not dependent on any single marriage or bloodline or name. Each family has a seat. Each seat is earned, not inherited. And the council has its own authority, its own mediation structure, its own operational independence. She looked at him. It'll be better this way. More stable, less vulnerable to exactly the kind of infiltration Hale spent 15 years executing, because it won't have a single point of failure. Once, but Roman understood. The single point of failure for 11 years had been her. One person holding everything up. He had been the visible structure and she had been the actual one, which meant the actual structure was one person, one woman, working alone, unacknowledged. And that was a fragility that Hale had identified and nearly exploited. Will you let me help? He said. Not run it, not take credit. Help? She looked at him. The look was long and honest and carried 11 years of its own arithmetic. The Castelli family has a seat at the council, she said, like every other family. No more, no less. That's not what I asked. I know. She held his gaze. Ask me again in a year. When you've spent some time understanding what it means to be part of something instead of the center of it. When I can see whether the man I'm looking at tonight is the man who shows up next month and the month after that. She paused. Ask me then, Roman nodded. One nod. The nod of a man who has finally understood that some things cannot be decided or demanded or negotiated into existence. They have to be earned, slowly, through the accumulation of different choices than the ones that got you to this room. Okay, he said. They sat together in the pre-dawn quiet while the city outside gathered itself toward morning. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly. It was too honest for comfort, too laden with everything it contained, but it was real, actual. The first real silence they had sat in together in longer than Roman could accurately remember. At some point, Dominic knocked and entered and said the car was ready, and Valentina slid off the table edge and picked up her briefcase and her laptop and moved toward the door, and Roman stood and followed. In the elevator down, she made 2 phone calls. The first to her personal physician, arranging for someone to meet her at an address she didn't share with Roman. The second to Marin Delacroix, brief and technical, confirming that Hale was secured and the network documentation would be distributed to each family within 24 hours. Marin said something Roman couldn't hear from across the elevator. Valentina said, I know, rest first, we'll talk tomorrow, and ended the call. The lobby of the building was empty. The street outside was the particular gray-blue of a New York morning at 5:30. Not dark, not light, existing in the specific liminal quality of a city not yet committed to the day. A car was waiting at the curb, not Roman's vehicles. A different car, smaller, driven by someone Roman didn't recognize, someone Valentina had clearly arranged before any of this began. She stopped at the sidewalk. Roman stopped beside her. She turned to look at him, fully, directly, the way she'd looked at the problem in the junction panel and the man in the chair upstairs. Without flinching from what was there. The summit reconvenes in 48 hours, she said. I'll have the corrected documents ready. Your legal team will need to review the revised conflict resolution protocols. I've restructured the mediation clause to give the independent council authority rather than routing it through the largest family. A pause. That means the Castellis lose some authority they've held since the beginning. I wanted you to hear that from me before you read it in the documents. Roman looked at her. It's the right call. Something in her face, small, quick, the flicker of something that had been waiting for a long time to surface and was still being careful about how much space it took up. Yes, it is. She turned toward the car. Val? She stopped, didn't turn around. What you did tonight, Roman said. Not just tonight, all of it. Everything you did that nobody saw. He stopped. There were no words that were the right size for it. He'd been a man of performance for so long that the authentic thing, the actual unadorned thing, didn't come with the vocabulary he'd practiced. It matters. You matter. Not to the Empire, not to the Alliance, to me. He paused. I know that's late. I know it's not enough on its own. But it's true. Valentina stood still on the sidewalk with her back to him for 3 seconds. The city moved around them. A delivery truck 2 blocks away, a pigeon landing on the curb beside the car, the first pale light of morning beginning to arrive from the east with the indifferent patience of something that happens regardless. She turned her head slightly. Not fully, just enough. "I know it's true," she said. "That's the hardest part." She got in the car. Roman stood on the sidewalk and watched it pull away from the curb and merge into the sparse early morning traffic and move down the block and turn the corner and disappear. He stood there after it was gone, a man on a sidewalk in a city that was just beginning to wake up, in a suit that had survived a night it wasn't designed for, understanding something that arrived too late and mattered too much and could only be addressed now, through the slow architecture of becoming a different person. Dominic appeared beside him, faithful, quiet, the presence that had been 3 steps behind him for 30 years and had spent the last several hours belonging partly to someone else. "Hospital," Dominic said. "What? You should have someone look at your hands." Roman looked down. His knuckles on the right hand were split. He had no memory of when that had happened, somewhere in the night's physical compression, some surface he'd hit without registering it. The blood had dried. "And then sleep," Dominic said. "A few hours. Everything else can start this afternoon." Roman looked at his hand, at the dried blood and the split skin and the evidence of a night that had rearranged the geography of his world from the inside out. "Dominic," he said, "when she was running the investigation, the 2 years." "Yes." "Were you afraid she wouldn't find it in time?" Dominic was quiet for a moment. A bus passed on the avenue. The light at the corner changed from red to green for no one. "No," Dominic said. "I was afraid she would, and that it would cost her more than it should have, because she was doing it alone." He paused. "Because the person who should have been beside her wasn't paying attention." Roman absorbed that, filed it next to everything else the night had given him that he would be carrying for a long time. "Let's go," he said. The summit reconvened 43 hours later. The corrected documents were distributed, the revised protocols were reviewed. The independent council structure was presented by Valentina to all 7 families in a meeting that lasted 4 hours and produced, for the first time in the Alliance's history, a governing framework that did not depend on the authority of any single family. Every delegation signed. Marin Delacroix signed first, with a pen she'd brought from New Orleans and kept for occasions she considered worth recording. Liang Zheng signed with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that some signatures conclude eras. Victor Yun signed without ceremony, which was its own kind of ceremony. When every family had signed, Valentina collected the documents, organized them with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything, and placed them in her briefcase. She shook hands with each delegation representative. She spoke briefly with Marin. She accepted, from Liang Zheng, the same gesture he had offered her after the first summit. His hand around hers, briefly, with the weight of an old man who has watched many things rise and fall, and knows the difference between what lasts and what doesn't. Roman sat at the Castelli table and watched all of it, and signed where he was supposed to sign, and said what he was supposed to say, and did not, at any point, attempt to be the center of it. It was the hardest thing he had done all week. In the months that followed, the Alliance operated differently. Disputes that previously escalated were addressed through the Council's mediation process. 3 territorial conflicts were resolved without bloodshed. One was resolved with less bloodshed than it would have produced without the Council's involvement, which was not perfect but was progress. And progress in that world was measured in the bodies that didn't accumulate. Conrad Hale's remaining network contacts were located and addressed by the relevant families. Marcus Viel cooperated completely with the investigation and spent a considerable amount of time in a room answering questions before the Alliance determined, collectively, what his cooperation had purchased. The answer was limited and specific, and not something Marcus would have chosen, but he had not been in a position to choose for some time. Roman rebuilt his organization's internal security from the ground up, which took 8 months and the involvement of people he had never previously trusted because he had never previously needed to. The process was uncomfortable and slow, and occasionally humiliating and absolutely necessary. He also, in those 8 months, learned the names of everyone who worked for him. Not their titles, their names. He started with the people closest, Dominic's security detail, his legal team, and worked outward. It was a small thing. It was not enough on its own. He did it anyway. He called Valentina on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after the summit, to report on a council matter that required Castelli input. The conversation was professional, brief, and conducted between two people who had established a working relationship that was entirely different from the one they'd had before. Cleaner in its edges, more honest in its terms, and carrying underneath the professional surface the specific weight of people who know each other too well and too truly to pretend otherwise. At the end of the call, before she hung up, she said, "How's your hand?" It took him a moment. Then he remembered the split knuckle on the sidewalk at 5:30 in the morning, and he almost said something about it, and then he understood that she wasn't asking about his hand. "Getting better," he said. "Slowly." A pause. "Okay," she said, and hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while. Outside his office window, New York was doing what it always did, indifferent, continuous, enormous. And somewhere in that city, in an office she had chosen and arranged and made entirely her own, a woman was building something from the ground up. Something that would outlast the names attached to it. Something that didn't need a throne to be real. He put the phone down. He went back to work. One cold morning in February, he passed her on the steps of a building where the council held its monthly meetings. She was coming out as he was going in. She wore a dark coat he hadn't seen before and carried the same briefcase she'd carried into the Imperial Crest Hall on the night that changed everything. Her hair was down, which surprised him. He could count on one hand the times he'd seen it down outside of private spaces. They stopped on the steps. The February air moved between them, cold and honest. "You look better," she said. "You look—" He stopped. Started again with something that wasn't performance. "You look like yourself." She studied him for a moment. The assessment, the calculation, the reading of a face she'd known for 11 years and was still, apparently, capable of finding new information in. Then she smiled. Not the controlled professional expression she deployed in meetings, not the measured acknowledgement she offered strangers. Something smaller and more real than either of those. The smile of someone who has survived something enormous and discovered on the other side of it that survival was not the end of the story. "I'll see you inside," she said. She walked down the steps. He watched her go. Then he turned and walked up the steps and through the door and into the room where the work continued, carrying everything the night had cost him and everything it had given him in the understanding, arrived at too late, held on to too hard, that the strongest things are almost never the loudest things in the room. They are the things that hold the room up, quietly, without ever being thanked for it, until they decide one day that they no longer need to.